So just to get on with the actual session, this is the second in our series of climate change and where we are. And today, like myself, Mike and Adam we're joined with by Aldyen Donnelly from Nori. They're a company that I'll let her tell you more about, but they're in North America. She's joining us from Vancouver, so that's why the strange time for us. And it's incredibly early for her, so thanks very much, Aldyen. It's all things to do with carbon credits and how those can be used for regenerative agriculture by kind of getting the money from polluters. That's about it. So I think, Aldyen, we'll let you talk for a bit about what you do. And then, Mike, if you can ask the first question, then Adam, and then I'll go after Adam, and then we'll kind of do it like that. And I'll try and keep an eye on technical things. All right.
Great. First of all, I've run into some technology issues. So I had prepared a slide deck, but won't be showing it this morning. But if you want to know about Nori, I'm a co-founder, one of Nori's co-founders. Please go to www.nori.com. And I think it's pretty easy to see what we're all about there. I will summarize. And also my commitment now is that Andrea is going to, I said your name wrong, didn't I?
Sorry, it's my partner's Zoom account because we don't have a Zoom account of our own yet. So I needed to use her premium one. So that's Andrea Herbert is my partner. It's her account.
All right. I was wondering why I didn't know your name.
Yeah, Ian Cable, sorry.
after we've been talking for a long time.
Yeah.
So Ian is going to collect your questions, and I'm inviting you to send more questions after that you see this YouTube to Ian, and he'll send them all to me. And my commitment is I will then produce a second slide deck that is my best attempt to respond to your questions. So that's how we'll make up for the fact that I can't show you slides now. Nori is 3 years old. It's a private startup, and our goal is to establish a true market for carbon credits where there's true price discovery and equal access for both small buyers and small suppliers, potential suppliers. It's also a dedicated, what we call carbon removal and retention market, and I'll explain why that's the case. So we live in a world where traditional, what we call now offset credit markets, which can be voluntary markets, can be markets that are designed to fit into a compliance regime, are markets that produce credits that represent any kind of combination of avoided emissions, emission reductions, land preservation. And we think those are valuable markets, but we think the service of carbon drawdown and retention in terrestrial reserves is a higher value service. And to get true price discovery, which I would argue we don't have in any of the emission markets, we feel it's important to differentiate between carbon removal and retention, and, for example, avoided emissions or forest preservation. We think the activities of avoided emissions or forest preservation are important, valuable activities, but we think of in a bowl of fruit, there's peaches and apples and pears, and they're not the same. And we think carbon drawdown and retention is a service that should attract a higher price, is higher value than avoided emissions or preserved carbon stocks. And so by setting up a distinct market for carbon removal and retention services, we should be attracting that price differential. In the larger context slides, I think I want to sort of talk about why this is so important now. I've been working in the climate change market solution policy space since the mid-1990s in various capacities. And to be honest, I've been working on particularly food and fiber producer, agriculture industry solutions, since the 1990s, always thought they were important. But the reality is that after almost 30 years of all of us policy wonks trying to figure out how to motivate the private sector to reduce their use and consumption of fossil fuel-based products, we haven't got very far. And we're now at a point where we are not on track to even achieve our Paris Agreement 2030 goals. And in my slides, when you see them, you'll see why. And so while integrating natural solutions into the mix of solutions we are promoting or incenting, might have been an interesting option 30 years ago. It's now a necessary and essential solution. Why is that true? Total greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas discharges to the atmosphere every year are estimated currently to be something like 57 billion tons a year. Of those 57 billion tons, when we net out the net greenhouse gas emissions that would be associated with nature without man-made intervention, it's estimated that the anthropogenic emissions, the share of those total emissions that is caused by human activity in general, is maybe 38 billion tons a year. In reality, less than 250 companies, when we attribute their operating emissions and the emissions their customers discharge when they consume the products and services they sell, so scope 1 plus scope 3 emissions to the companies, fewer than 250 companies account for 84% of all anthropogenic discharges, and 50 companies alone account for 66% of all of the anthropogenic discharges. And of those companies, when we account for scope 1 and scope 3 emissions, 100% are planning on increasing their scope 1 plus scope 3 discharges through 2035. So it's just physically impossible for us to even meet the 2030 Paris goal target. It's not possible for the national plans that are in place right now to get to the 2030 target to be realized when all of the leading companies have plans that are not aligned. And my argument is that we need to focus on what is required to help those companies move to having plans that are aligned with the goals that we think are necessary. But we also recognize that's going to take time. So right now, the only way for us to be by 2030 on a trajectory to capping the warming risk at 2 degrees by 2100 is to actually mobilize natural solutions. Not necessarily only as an interim measure, but it's the only tool we have available to us that we can mobilize relatively quickly, that can get us in alignment with our 2030 and 2040 targets in the absence of a fundamental restructuring of the energy and building product sectors. Which fundamental sector restructuring, I'm just saying, I think it's impractical. I think we'll get that all wrapped up in the next 9 years, less than 9 years. So just to put the supply side in context, the 244 largest emitters, scope 1, accounting for scope 1 and scope 3, are currently discharging around 32 billion tons a year. The top 50 are discharging, I don't have my slides in front of me, something like 22 or 23 billion tons a year. If we assume that global food and fiber producers have the capacity to continue producing food and fiber, so I'm not talking about taking cropland and grazing land out of commercial production, but changing practices while they remain in commercial production. The global soil scientists believe that we can do that, and while restoring carbon stocks in the top 30 centimeters of the soil layer globally, back to what those soil carbon stock levels were 300 years ago. And if that's our saturation point, global food and fiber producers have the capacity to draw down somewhere between 10 and 25 billion tons a year, each year, if we give ourselves 100 years to phase in those projects, and 100 years to get those stocks back up to 300-year-ago levels. That sounds complicated, but it's just me doing some arithmetic saying it's unrealistic to think we can mobilize all of those solutions overnight. So if I'm sort of practical about a phase in, there is 10 to 25 billion tons a year of potential there globally, when the constraint I'm putting on the arithmetic is that we are not taking food and fiber producing land out of commercial production to achieve those goals. So our food and fiber producers globally can't offset 100% of the 32 billion tons a year the top 244 companies are discharging, but they can offset a very, very significant portion. And when we adopt the practices on food, on croplands and grazing lands that do draw down and sequester incremental carbon, the return on investment of a sort of a perfectly architected transition from extractive to regenerative production processes is not tenable for a farmer or livestock producer who does not have access to carbon credit revenues, but does deliver a payback in typically in 12 to 20 years. So we could use carbon markets to finance the transition, but in fact, after 12 to 20 years of transition, it's reasonable to expect the new practices that are drawing down and sequestering carbon could be self-sustaining even without carbon market revenues. So there's an opportunity to shift our food and fiber producers over to regenerative practices that draw down and store incremental carbon. There's a possibility that those practices will be maintained over the long term, even if the carbon credit revenues disappear after 12 to 20 years. The other, it's essential for us to mobilize this and any other strategies we can for us to have any hope to cap the risk of warming at 2 degrees by 2100. And the co-benefits of looking at getting this done are very significant. Investments that shift our food and fiber production practices from extractive to regenerative it's almost the only greenhouse gas management strategy we can mobilize that is what we call a twofer, in that when we sequester more carbon in the soils and operate to maintain those carbon stocks, our soils are both a greenhouse gas risk mitigation tool, but we are also building a more resilient topsoil layer, which is more likely to be productive in the event of global warming. So it's an investment that is both a mitigation and adaptation strategy in one. I don't think there are very many other strategies that have benefits on both sides. in that way. There's lots we can talk about, ranging from the science of understanding what's going on in the soil to maybe what we think good policy looks like, to what are the best opportunities. So I wonder if it's a good idea maybe for me to just stop there and say, let's do some Q&A.
Thanks, Alden. Yeah, that's really good. So I'm just trying to do some technical stuff in the background there. Mike, do you want to kick off with the questions?
Apologies, that's all right. Took a while to come off mute. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm Mike Regent. I lead on the comms and media side for the collective, and hence an interest in all of these podcasts. Although Ian is our education and technical lead, who also does a lot on engagement. So, as a collective, we operate very closely together. In terms of questions, we've been having a look at what's coming in. So I sort of merged a couple up here. Martin has asked about, can you describe the process you went through to secure funding for the sequestration, and a little bit about the metrics, sort of contracts and verification process, and sort of allied to that, another question on what's a realistic price for carbon, and how quickly and steeply does it need to rise to be effective?
I'll try to be quick on the answer to the first question, and I know I'll be controversial on my response to the second question, unfortunately. This Nori, which is I think very exciting, is my second pass at this can. Back in the 1990s in Canada, I formed and led a consortium of 14 of Canada's 20 largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters. So they were oil and gas utilities, pipelines, operators, one large oil company that operates largely in the oil sands, and then Canada's largest chemical producer. And we this is going to sound kind of naive, but they were very large companies in a Canadian context that were about to expand into international markets. Some of them have big presences in the UK right now. And in the mid-90s, I was a consultant, and I was hired by some of them to help them figure out how to scope out and manage what they called the greenhouse gas issue. And this is going to sound funny, but I decided to bring together, instead of doing the same work for over and over again for each client, we created a consortium. And we decided that the way to figure out what to inform their business plans and their positions on policy would be to send me out to do the first of offset purchases in long-term agreements, and have them decide whether they liked how that worked out or didn't like how that worked out, and have them then decide later individually, not as a consortium, what they were going to do. So early in the process, I had a bunch of big emitters, all from the energy companies, saying, okay, go pick some strategically important projects and develop those 10 to 15 year offset credit. In those days, we didn't even say offsets, emission reduction credit purchase agreements for us to learn through. And the first question was, well, if we can if we can offset our footprint anywhere, where should we send our money first? And it took us a while to figure out that if you're a company and you're going to buy real interest in emission reductions in somebody else's inventory, you should be exploiting your what we called critical strategic supply chain and your most price sensitive critical customers first. So if you're going to spend $10 a ton in your own operations, you have to increase your prices to recover $10 a ton plus your expected return on investment and pass that through as a price increase. Well, if there's a supply chain on whom you depend and from whom you take price, you're better off spending that sending that $10 a ton to them. You got to increase your prices, but you're sending new revenues to somebody who's going to pass the cost increase through to you. So that's just better economics. And if you're also sending new revenues to your most price sensitive customer base, that makes more sense than just sending them a price increase. So once we figured that out, I got to sit down with the accounts payable and receivable of all of these 14 companies and ranked who our target for offset purchases should be. And ultimately, food and fiber producers, the ag community, was on the top 3 list of everybody on both sides. So from a pure business standpoint, we did not know that if or that there was any opportunity to reduce emissions or draw down carbon in the food and fiber production sectors. We knew that prudent business strategy is look there first. So that's how we started. And I really think we should all still be thinking that way, no matter what. Then we went to explore what the opportunities were. And in fact, that group of energy companies in Canada financed the foundational science that a lot of soil carbon estimation is still based on, and a small market in Alberta, which is no longer vibrant or functioning, and that's an important cautionary tale, was launched. And between 2008 and 2015, the largest emitting energy and companies and utilities paid Alberta food and fiber producers for 13.7 million credits for adopting conservation practices, is what they were called. To put that in context, worldwide, 100% of the offset credits that have been issued to agriculture in all of the offset markets, including the Alberta one, total less than 14 million. So 13.7 million out of 14 million were bought by big emitters in the Canadian market that was spawned off that experiment. So in Nori, we're saying, why aren't we doing the global version of that? So a lot of what we're doing in the Nori market design is trying to address the barriers to progress that we see in traditional offset markets. Maybe going on to price, here I go controversial on you. If you look historically at all cap and trade market or other pollution reduction market strategies that we've mobilized to protect air quality and water going back to 1960, and I've looked at 44 precedents in North America, Europe, and Japan. Interesting thing is that while everybody's getting ready to design the market, we imagine very, very high pollution credit prices, whether it's, SO2 emissions or NOx emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And in every precedent, the highest price anybody paid for credits was realized in the early years of the market design. Then there appears to be a price crash and burn. Then there appears to be and that crash and burn usually hits within 5 to 7 years. Then there appears to be 5 to 7 years of policy distress and market disruption. Then prices go up again and then they go down. What goes on every time, and I think this is going on now too, is everybody assumes that what we need to do is figure out how to control, manage, or address emissions in our existing capital stock, on the assumption that we're going to operate most of the existing capital stock for its normal useful life, and we're going to pay, and the market's going to pay to control emissions while carrying that capital stock through to the end of its normal operating life. And in reality, if and when society's commitment to achieving the pollution or greenhouse gas emission reduction goal gets serious, for a long time, the least cost solution is to abandon, write down, and replace that existing capital stock ahead of the end of its normal operating life. So what does that mean? It means we know we can work out what I call an expropriation compensation reference price for carbon. And when we shift from trying to get it right to getting it right, we can probably do two things. We can probably expect eventually that reference price to be reveal itself in the marketplace. And we can also say if policy that we're proposing cannot work out unless prices are 2 or 3 times that reference price, then maybe we should revisit our ideas about what efficient and effective policy is. So what's the reference price? I'm not going to give you specific numbers, primarily because this is an analysis I'm in the habit of doing once a year, but I've been too busy and I haven't got it done in the last 18 months. So my numbers will not be up to date. So here's how you do it. You download British BP, Shell, and Exxon's financial reports, and you imagine that you had an unlimited amount of money, and you could buy all 3 of those companies by offering the shareholders 1.5 times the highest value their shares traded for over the last 12 months. Write down that number. Then you look at their balance sheets and you imagine you are going to pay down all of their long-term debt in cash. Add that number. Then assume that if you're going to be shutting down and writing off certain operations, that you will probably have to pension out 50% of their payroll at full pension regardless of age. Write down the cost of doing that. And assume that you've got some contaminated sites you're going to have to recover, and the budgets in their financial statements to do that are too small, and multiply them by 4, and you're going to have to pay that. So that's big numbers. We aren't forcing companies into bankruptcy. Every equity investor and every debt holder has been repaid and it's now sitting on a bunch of cash and looking for ways to reinvest. And now imagine, this is theoretically, I'm not proposing this. Now imagine that as the owner of those companies, you shut in all of their proved and unproved fossil fuel reserves and shut down all of their operating assets that rely on fossil fuel feedstocks, again, theoretically. And then you divide the amount of money you just paid. I would offer, people can come up with different metrics, by 20 years of avoided scope 1 plus scope 3 emissions from those operations. I've been doing that analysis since 1999, and I've never got a number that's higher than $68 US a ton. So I'm saying that when we have a vibrant, real, efficient set market with policies that are efficient, we should not expect the price of carbon to be higher than that. And if you do that same analysis as I do for 50 companies, including a bunch of coal production companies around the world, many of whom have gone through bankruptcy in the last few years, before bankruptcy, the cost of buying and shutting in some of the world's major coal producers would have been below $10 a ton. Now, if you shut out some of the supply chain, the least cost part of the supply chain to shut out, then the market value of the companies that remain goes up. So when I say $68 a ton, that's the number you get from doing that analysis. That's the top number you get for the top 50. I leave that with you because I would argue that if and when we're engaged in the development and implementation of policies that we know don't work at carbon prices less than $200 or $300 or $400 a ton, I would argue that's an indication that the policies that we think we've got right are still not efficient and effective. Now, in food and fiber production, I would argue, even in the developed world, if we were looking at stable carbon prices in the $35 to $50 US a ton range, we could mobilize the volume of greenhouse gas drawdown and retention. that that we need in the short term.
Thanks. That was a very comprehensive answer. I hope it's provided everything that was in the question. I'll hand back to Ian.
Adam, do you want to go with the next one?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, thanks for that. So it's very interesting. And there's a lot of discussion in the UK at the moment about soil carbon capture at the moment. So one of the questions from an anonymous user is, energy companies prefer a quick win with the least amount of effort. Will these be one-off carbon credits or long-term buy-ins to help the projects grow long-term?
I think I firmly believe the answer is carbon credits, and again, I'm going to go controversial here. We're saying carbon credits, but we're trying to make it work in a market where what we're creating and trading are entitlements to discharge greenhouse gases, which are not carbon credits. So we're saying one thing and we're trying to implement another thing. And the thing we should be implementing is a carbon credit market. I can follow up, but whenever we've been serious in the past, whether it was eliminating the hole in the ozone layer, eliminating lead emissions or reducing the tailpipe lead emissions, reducing sulfur dioxide and other air quality damaging emissions. If you look back at our history of very significant policy success stories, when we finally got it right, we did not create tradable, bankable emissions quota, which is what we're trying to do now. When we decided to reduce lead emissions, we said if you supply gasoline or petrol, you report your lead content per gallon of sales, and you reduce it. And any combination of suppliers can comply jointly. Every time when we wanted to reduce the discharges that were damaging the ozone layer, we did not trade emission entitlements. We said report the ozone depleting substance, the pollution precursor in the refrigerant chemical supply chain, and you cut it at a regulated rate, and any combination of regulated suppliers can comply jointly. In all of those cases, secondary pollution precursor over compliance credit markets were created, managed by the private sector. And the government's job was to make sure that severally or jointly the obligated parties complied with the limits. So it turns out every time we've been serious about reducing pollutions or discharges to the atmosphere, we regulated pollution precursor content in the supply chain, not rights to emit at the point of end use or production. So what's the greenhouse gas version? The greenhouse gas version is a regulation, and there has to be regulation that says if you supply any energy projects, I don't care what kind of project mix makes up your portfolio, you report your total sales in gigajoule or million BTU equivalents, and your global supply chain fossil carbon content per unit of sale, and you reduce it at, pick the appropriate rate, 5% per annum, and any combination of obligated parties, suppliers, can comply jointly, and you only have 3 alternative compliance options. You can apply credits for carbon drawdown and retention to that compliance obligation. And I would also include actually 4 credits for large investments in energy efficiency in existing industrial and building stock, and also large investments, private investments in public transportation infrastructure. And I would have no more than those 3 alternative compliance options on the table. And that would be a greenhouse gas regulation that is entirely consistent with every one of our successful pollution reduction success stories. The key is the obligated parties are suppliers of energy, and that what they are reporting and jointly reducing is the virgin fossil carbon content in their supply chain. And it's entirely up to them to compete on price and figure out solutions. One quick thing going back to leaded fuel in 1978, when most of the nations around the world decided to get the lead out of petrol. It was commonly understood in the energy sector, in the vehicle sector, in government, in academia, that there was going to be one solution, and that was going to be ethanol would be the oxygenate replacing lead. And by 1984, the fuel industry had developed and introduced 4 competing unleaded fuel formulations, 3 of which nobody had imagined before 1978. And the reason we got that level of innovation is because the regulation did not prescribe ethanol as the lead substitute. The regulation said to the suppliers, get the lead out, figure out how to do it. And in fact, in North America, by 1990, the lead was out of retail petrol sales, while retail prices of petrol gasoline had fallen 12%. I can send you some slides. By comparison, when we ordered the lead out, the European Economic Community introduced a lead differential tax with a strong view that a tax would work. Lead wasn't finally out of petrol in the 8 EU members who hung in there with the petrol tax till 18 years after lead had been removed from retail sales in North America with the product standard, because the lead tax, where government was setting price, was not efficient.
Thank you. A very comprehensive answer again. Pass over to Ian.
Alden,
do you want to tell me to do short answers from now on? Am I boring you?
No, not at all.
It's okay. Alden, just quickly on that. I don't know whether I understand the mechanisms as to why a carbon tax itself doesn't work in the same way or efficiently enough. What are there underlying reasons for that maybe I've missed?
I think there are, and I have to be clear here. When I was trying to figure out why policies I thought would work weren't working, I could see, you can see in the data that they aren't working. So that I think if you look hard at the data, you can see that. So that to me is a fact. Why they aren't working, I'm now hitting you with my theories. I'd love to see smarter people than me do the analysis and come up with their own theories.
Okay.
But if you look worldwide at any pollution tax, whether it's the lead tax or greenhouse gas taxes, you see a few things. First of all, so far, no matter where you're looking, you don't see any correlation between change in tax rate and retail price signal, ever, anywhere. Unless, of course, the tax you're talking about is a VAT tax or percent tax. But if the tax is denominated in, if the tax on consumption is a fixed rate tax, even if it's changing, you don't see any. So the price signal that the theory says the consumer is going to see when you introduce the tax doesn't happen, or it hasn't happened. And you can look at data for all of Europe, US, Japan, and Canada going back to 1972, and it hasn't happened. So some academics say to me, it will, it just takes time. Well, 1972 is a long time ago. How much longer are we going to wait for this tax thing to work? So basically, when you introduce a tax in any marketplace, especially if it's a marketplace that's dominated by vertically and horizontally integrated suppliers, it's normal and reasonable business practice to immediately adjust wholesale prices to shift the tax burden both geographically and across the product line to maximize revenues and margins. So government might be putting a tax on a particular product to send us a certain signal, and absolutely operating legally and normally and prudently. Private sector is adjusting wholesale prices to maximize their margins. and the tax impact never hits where you think you're putting it.
Okay.
That's one thing. There's another thing that I think is really important, and it's the concept that demand for energy products is price elastic. And if you look at the data, even if you see price signals, you don't see the consumer response that you would expect. And as an economist, I kept saying to myself, why? That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. And why is the theory wrong? And I'm an old lady, and I started to read through economic textbooks. And I can't send you an electronic version of this. When I got into the textbooks in the 60s and the 70s that were introducing the concept of price elasticity and of demand, in the early textbooks, they differentiate between what they called primary and secondary consumption decisions. So some of the consumption decisions we make are derived from, those are the secondary or derived consumption decisions from primary consumption decisions. And in the earliest textbooks, they made the point that for a price signal to change consumption, it has to be applied at the point of a primary consumption decision. It's not going to have the same impact on a derived or secondary consumption decision. Well, most of our energy purchases are derived from our decisions to buy houses and where they're located relative to work and school, the kinds of car and appliances and equipment we make. So in fact, the early textbooks were right. If you were reading the early textbooks, you would tax the vehicle purchase, annual vehicle registration. You would tax the appliances based on their efficiency rating. The early textbooks said that. The early textbooks said taxing the actual energy use is going to be inefficient and less effective because those are derived decisions. I can't explain why that differentiation between primary and secondary and derived didn't make its way through to the textbooks that we were being taught from in the 80s and 90s. So the theory's right. We just forgot the theory. So what does that mean? If you look in Europe, where you're seeing the higher market penetrations of more efficient vehicles, in Norway right now, Norway is collecting more revenues from taxes on new vehicle purchases and annual car registrations based on the fuel efficiency or emissions rating of those vehicles than they're collecting in all forms of tax at the gas pump, which is what the textbooks from the 60s and 70s said would work. So let's remember what the original theory was, because it was right.
So it's basically focusing on the efficiency of the things that we use in terms of, it's all about the energy, the cost of energy underpinning things, and linking that to the efficiency of the actual stuff that we use.
Yeah, if you want to use a tax to change our consumption, energy consumption patterns, the price signal has to be on the equipment purchase or that we're making, that is from which our energy consumption decisions are derived. So I'm opposed to using a tax, but if you're going to use a tax, go upstream. And there's a third part, and there's this whole body of literature that is not referenced in my experience in the climate change policy area, that talks about also household internal and personal internal discount rates, unrelated. All humans, regardless of income level across the developed world, display very high internal discount rates. We will avoid a capital expenditure at a great deal of operating expense. We reveal consistently when we're looking at decisions to buy more efficient appliances. There's 30 years of literature that says that even very, very financially astute people will display a 25 to 40% internal discount rate. We will bear increasing operating costs and not make that capital expenditure to avoid those operating costs till late. And that decision profile suggests a 25 to 40% internal discount rate for the general population, which means we will bear big operating increase week to week to avoid a capital expenditure. So the other reason to go upstream to the tax on the vehicle or a tax on the annual vehicle re-registration is because it feels like a capital expenditure. I swear the data suggests that 1,500 pounds per year of tax once a year when you go to re-register your vehicle will get a behavior change that would not happen at less than $2,500 to $3,000 worth of tax if the tax is at the petrol pump.
Okay. I was going to try and ask a question about certifying regenerative agriculture. There's a scheme in the UK apparently. I don't know whether it's called A Greener World. Ben Evans has asked this question, saying regenerative local farm near him has taken part of a pilot scheme. Have you heard of certified regenerative, and also how do you guys look at regenerative agriculture with your farmers that you give credits for?
The right solution is going to be different for each country, but in the United States, our starting point is to gather practice history, soil treatment, and cropping and livestock management practice history from a farmer, and also documentation on current practices. And with that data, we run estimates through a model called Gidget that is run by a company called Soil Metrics. But Soil Metrics is the entity that's licensed to use a government-created model called Comet Farm. And Comet Farm has been in development since 2002. And the Comet Farm model, you can access it freely on the web, was designed to allow U.S. farmers to put in their land use history, enter their land use history for their fields, and then propose or entertain different changes in practices. And when they put in the changes in practices, the model kicks out a 10-year projection of what they think the greenhouse gas and soil organic carbon stock impacts of changing the practices might be. So this was a tool that was built to help food and fiber producers make practice change decisions. We have in the background got a license. We've modified the tool, so we are using that for a different purpose, which is to estimate changes in soil organic carbon stocks. And we think there's lots of different ways of building a tool that has the same value, but might look different and might be based on different modeling. So I'm not saying you got to do it the way that Comet Farm is done, which was built by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We picked Comet Farm as our first tool to use for that purpose because all of the land use change relevant sections in the official U.S. greenhouse gas inventory are estimates that are using the same tools, so we know we are issuing credits in the United States that are entirely consistent with how the national inventory is built. And if they change how the national inventory is built, our credit issuance will automatically change in that consistent manner. So that was our primary reason for choosing it. So we love to work and consult with governments of other nations saying, what's the fastest way to get the best version, the cheapest way to get the best version of that kind of tool in place in your jurisdiction? And what we're finding is the issue isn't we can't figure out a way, it's what's of the 3 or 4 ways we can see doing it quickly and easily, which is the best one. And I want to go back to one, and then I'll try to stop talking too much, but I'll go back to one key thing we found, which is soil sampling and testing. Robust soil sampling and testing is an essential component of getting the market design right. And it's absolutely wrong to require soil sampling and testing in every field, even if it's testing that only recurs once every 5 years. That doesn't get you numbers that are useful for various reasons we can get into if people want to. But the the starting point of designing your market is to sit down with the best agronomists you know and the best statisticians you know, and map out what are the locations for the minimum number of statistically representative sites where we need to do, where we are going to do soil sampling and testing once every 3 years, unbelievably rigorously, spend a lot of money on it, so that we're getting results that we can reasonably extrapolate to develop soil organic carbon stock change estimates for the wider population of food and fiber producers you want to integrate in the marketplace. When you do that mapping, set up that that research infrastructure, and then do your estimation of incremental soil organic carbon stock change on the basis of practice inputs from the growers, you will get estimates that are no more uncertain than the estimates you would get out of in-field testing. The difference is that if you build this statistically representative network, the cost of soil sampling and testing in the US context, if we do it with representative network, making some very, very generous assumptions, the network in the United States is not sufficient right now, but if we build it out to what we think is sufficiency, if the private sector had to put a tax on credit sales to maintain that infrastructure, to maintain the market, when in the United States, food and crop and livestock producers are selling credits equal to only 5% of their annual potential, the tax we would have to charge to maintain that science research infrastructure would be less than 80 cents US per ton. By comparison, to comply directly with the new Climate Action Registry or VERA protocols or the Australian soil sampling and testing requirement, the soil sampling and testing and verification costs in those marketplaces are eating up at least $15 US a ton of the price the market pays. So do that statistical analysis, say what's that network of research sites we have to set up? How do we set them up in such a way that if we start them with government spending, we've created a high likelihood that the private sector will be motivated to take over and maintain that infrastructure so that they have a vibrant market they can maintain. And don't go for a quantification science or data collection strategy or option that's going to cost $15 a ton when you can build one that can cost less than $1 a ton.
Thank you. I was going to say we've come to the end of our kind of slot now, one thing that was we had when you were talking to me before was really interesting was that no agricultural system in any westernized country has ever managed to wash its own face in terms of paying for its costs. All of them have to be subsidized in some way, isn't it? And this would be, one of the methods that we could get more money to them. And I think also if you work regeneratively, you can reduce the costs of running your farm because you don't have to pay so much for fertilizers and things. So it could be something that helps reduce running costs in future as well going forwards.
That's very, very, very important. Storing incremental carbon almost always is increasing the efficiency of food production. It takes 7 to 12 years to realize those efficiency gains. So there's two really important parts here. One, so the carbon market is an opportunity to get them through that really difficult period before they're realizing a return on that investment. But they get to a point where there's a return on that investment without the carbon revenues. So that's really, really positive. But can I say one other thing? You're right. I don't know what every society, no matter how different they are culturally and historically, when they shift from subsistence level food production to industrialized food production, there is no place where consumers pay prices for food and fiber sufficient to cover the cost of producing and delivering the food and fiber to them. I don't know why that's true. It's really weird. It's true everywhere. The carbon market opportunity is not only an opportunity to get food and fiber to a more efficient place where it's easier to deliver higher value for low cost. It's also an interestingly, maybe unprecedented opportunity to get new revenues, at least for a few decades into the food and fiber supply chain from outside the food and fiber supply chain. And if you get that new revenues from new sources, i.e. the large emitter energy and building product sectors, while they're managing their strategy to transition to lower emissions internally, you are creating a much more secure food and fiber supply chain that has a shot at revenues from outside the food and fiber supply chain. That's like really important, really important. That's an opportunity you don't want to let pass by.
Okay, we must do everything we can to prevent it from passing by then. All right, Aldyen, thank you very much for joining us. We have run out of time, but there's a couple more questions, but we'll just get them sent to you and you can answer them afterwards. I'd just like to say thanks very much for doing this, and also thanks Adam and Mike. It takes a lot of pressure off doing it on your own, so thanks very much. Any feedback from anyone, please let us know. We want to make these as good as possible, so just let us know in Slack or email us. Okay, Aldyen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye.
Thanks.
Cheers, Mike. Cheers, Adam.
Cheers.